Before we begin this class with a look at the Old Testament, let's open up with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for providing a place out of the weather tonight and giving us the opportunity to be able to come here and consider another aspect of the compilation of your word, and even some of the other areas that might deal with not necessarily how it was put together, but as we begin this look at the Old Testament, Father, teach us about some of these external things, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the lost books of the Bible and just the text of the Old Testament itself. Open our hearts tonight, Lord, and teach us what you'd have us to as we dedicate the time. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, if you'll open up your outlines, we'll begin tonight. We'll start on a look at the Old Testament. This is called Old Testament Part 1. Next week we'll have Old Testament Part 2. And probably we'll deal with just everything you've ever wanted to know about the Old Testament, plus a whole bunch of things you could have cared less about. And if there's any questions that you might have had that don't get addressed, if you want to wait till next week to see if maybe we cover it then, or if you don't, that's fine. Go ahead and raise your hand, and some of these things we'll deal with in a semi-in-depth way. Some of them we'll just gloss over. A lot of these topics that we'll be discussing specifically in the next 3 weeks are things we could spend many nights on just any one of these main headings, and we'll spend just a few minutes on each one. So I might give you more information on any given topic than you'll be able to take in, or I might give a bunch that you don't care about and not address the specific question that you wanted to have answered. If that's the case, then please stop me and ask. Okay, extant portions of the Old Testament. Who can tell me what the word extant means? We talked about this in the opening weeks, and it's one of your vocabulary words. What's the word extant mean? Yeah, Butch. Still in existence, okay. Butch read his vocabulary list. It just simply means still in existence. So when we talk about extant portions of the Old Testament, these are manuscripts that are, old ancient manuscripts that are still around. We have them. We can take them out and look at them and examine them. Now, when we talk about the New Testament, extant manuscripts of the New Testament, we're talking thousands. I mean, there's 5,000 in the Greek alone. And when you take into account all of the other translations, Latin, Syriac, and so on, I've seen the figure everywhere from 13,900 to 15,000. So somewhere around the 14,000 ballpark. That's what we've got in extant manuscripts of the Old Testament. If you look here, or on the New Testament, if you look here on your outlines, you see 6 manuscripts mentioned here. By and large, that's it. With the Old Testament, by and large, that's it. And now we're talking about in the Hebrew. A lot of the New Testament manuscripts we have the Old Testament with them because they're parchments of the entire Bible. But as far as the Old Testament, Hebrew Old Testament Bible, this is just about it. So we'll briefly look at each one of them. We got the Codex of the Prophets, which is located in Leningrad at the church there in Leningrad. It dates back to A.D. 916, which sounds like a long time ago, and it is. I mean, we're talking over 1,000 years ago. That's when this manuscript was produced. But then the canon of Old Testament was completed 2,500 years ago. And so there's 1,500 years from Malachi to this Codex of the Prophets. For a long time, this was considered to be the oldest portion of the Old Testament in existence. And it was strictly the latter prophets. Remember we had the former and the latter prophets? Well, this is the latter prophets. Okay, the Codex of the Old Testament is also in Leningrad. This is just what it's called, Codex of the Old Testament, the Leningrad Codex, and it dates back to A.D. 1010. This is the only complete manuscript that we have of the Old Testament. where someone just, here's a manuscript and this is it, from Genesis to 2nd Chronicles. It's the only one that we have. The Oxford Codex, so-called because that's where it is, in Oxford, and it dates back to the early 11th century. So it's around the same time period as the Codex in Leningrad, and it's nearly complete. Some of it's missing, but it's nearly complete. And then there's at the Synagogue of Aleppo, which is, I think it's would be the equivalent of modern-day Lebanon. It's somewhere around Lebanon or the Asia Minor area or someplace right around there, north of Israel anyway. The Aleppo Codex, it dates back to the early 10th century. So this is going back into the 900s. And originally it was the entire text. So originally it was the second complete manuscript that we had, and it was 100 years older than the one in Leningrad. But during the fightings that took place in 1948, when Israel was established as a nation, and fighting with the Palestinians and everything, it turned up missing. And for about 10 years was considered to be lost. And this was the most valuable manuscript of the Hebrew Bible in existence. And it was thought to be lost and destroyed in the fighting. But then in 1958, it resurfaced, and it was still fairly much intact. There were certain parts of it that had been damaged and destroyed, but it's still in pretty good shape. And it's considered to be the best manuscript of the 10th century as far as quality goes, the quality of the manuscript. We have a copy of the Pentateuch in the British Museum that dates back to the 9th century, about the middle of the 9th century, sometime around 850. So now we're getting even older, but this is just the Torah. It's just the books of Moses. And then we have a Codex of the Prophets that was found in Cairo, and it has a date on it that it was sold, and that date is 895. So that's the date. So we know it was in existence in 895. We don't know, it could have been 5 years old, or it could have been 100 years old at that time. They don't know. And this contained both the former and the latter prophets. Now, in the field of Old Testament textual criticism, which we'll talk somewhat about tonight, if you remember from the first week where we talked about textual criticism, that science which seeks to establish an accurate text by looking at various manuscripts. In the field of Old Testament textual criticism, this is just about what they got to work with. As they lay these manuscripts out side by side, and you notice only one of them is the whole Bible. And they look and try to say, okay, is the Bible, the words that we have printed in our Old Testament, are they really the ones? Does our book of Isaiah, is it really the words that Isaiah spoke? From a scientific point of view, as a scientific approach, is this exactly what Isaiah wrote down? Yeah, Bill.
The dates that they put on here, how do they establish when they get like 1916? That's a pretty exact date versus the 11th century.
Well, it could be various methods. Now, on a specific date like that, it would be probably something that would be dated. It would have a frontispiece or tailspiece that would say something about in the year of such and such, whether it actually had the date, or if it was speaking of the third year of a certain rabbi, or whoever the emperor was, or something like that. But in the field of textual criticism, there's just not much to go on. And so we can look at this and we can say, well, how do we know that Isaiah, my book of Isaiah, is really the one that Isaiah wrote? I mean, where is the veracity? Where is what can we compare this to when this is all we have? When, as I said, you talk about the New Testament, you got all of these thousands of manuscripts that you can look at. And it's very easy for us to vindicate the claims of the New Testament by simply saying, well, look at this degree of agreeance with all of these thousands of manuscripts, and this is how close we are here. But then in the Old Testament, we got, the opposite is the case. But we'll find out as we go through this that that in itself, just the fact that there's just a handful of these, I mean, we could put all of the manuscripts right on that table. And just that fact by itself lends a lot of credence to the claims of the Old Testament and the fact that we can trust the fact that it has been preserved and that we have an accurate text before us in our Bibles. So the question might come to mind, why? I mean, why is that all there is? When in the New Testament it's the complete opposite. Why are there just this handful of manuscripts? We had the opportunity to go to a Jewish Sabbath service a few years ago. And at one part during the service, they open up the ark back in the back. They open up this big cabinet affair, and they bring out the scrolls. And they were just these big handwritten manuscript affairs, and they were capped with gold, and they had these gold tassels on them. And they brought them out and marched them up and down the aisle, and everybody just started partying and clapping. And as they walked by, people would kiss their hands, kiss the tips of their fingers, and reach out and touch the gold tassels as they marched this thing back and forth. And I mean, they got into this piece of scroll. They venerated this piece of scroll. They just thought this was the coolest part of their service, was marching this thing up and down. And so if the Jews have that type, I mean, we could almost say an attitude of worship toward the Torah and that written record of God. Why would they only have this many? And that's the way it's been for centuries. They've had that kind of attitude. Then why is there just a handful of manuscripts? Well, there's a couple of reasons. And they're both very good reasons and very important ones because they're test questions. And the first one is just simply that fact that it was so venerated by the rabbis and by the Jewish leaders that they held the law in such high, just the whole Old Testament, they held it in such high esteem that after a period of time, manuscripts, you can only use them so long. I mean, even in the dry, arid climate of the Middle East, no matter how much you care for a papyrus manuscript, the most it's going to last is several decades. And, it's about the quality of newsprints. You know what you find a newspaper's been laying up in a cupboard for 20 years, you know how brittle they are. Well, take one, that just after a period of time, they're no good anymore. And even parchment can only be used so often and so much, and it begins to use its usability. So they had a fear that something as great as the Word of God, after it served its purpose and was no longer suitable to be used in the synagogue service and so on, they had a fear that it would be used for some sort of profane thing. Somebody would turn it over and write a shopping list on the backside or something like that. And so for fear out of that, they thought the best thing to do, okay, well, we got this great manuscript and it's used up. We'll copy it down. We'll make some copies of it, and then we'll do the right thing and give it a proper burial. And that's what they did. And so they destroyed the copies or the manuscripts after they got too old to be used. They destroyed them, and that's one of the reasons why there aren't very many of them around. They buried them. And another reason is, you see here on your outlines, the critical work of the Masoretes. Now, if you were to look in the introduction to your Old Testament in your Bible, you would probably read something along the lines of that the text that was used is what's known as the Masoretic text. And by and large, that is the text that's used in all English Bibles, practically all Christian Bibles. In some degree or fashion, they use what has become known as the Masoretic text. Maybe you've read that and wondered what in the world Masoretic meant. What is the Masoretic text? Well, beginning early into the Christian era, there began a tradition of, in fact, the word you see here, the Masoretes, it comes from a Hebrew word mesore, which means tradition. And there began a tradition toward the end of the first century of how the text of the Bible, and we're talking about the Old Testament, how that text was to become standardized. Now, this was primarily began by a man. I'll just go ahead and write his name on the board tonight, and we'll talk more about him next week. There was a guy by the name of Rabbi Akiba. Sometimes you'll see it spelled with a K, A-Q-I-B-A, or A-K-I-B-A, Rabbi Akiba. And toward the end of the first century, through his work of scholarship, as he looked at the various manuscripts that were at his disposal. Now, he had a lot more than what we have today, but he looked at the manuscripts that were at his disposal, as well as looking at things such as the Septuagint, which was another witness toward the text of the Old Testament, the Samaritan Bible, which we'll talk about after the break, which is another witness toward the text of the Pentateuch anyway, as well as some of the other writings. You know, like, remember I said last week that if we just use the quotations of the church fathers, we could restore all of the New Testament except 11 verses. Well, they had the same sort of thing in their day. And so if they were just looking at the writings and the teachings of the rabbis that quoted from the Old Testament, then that was a witness to the text of the Old Testament. So Rabbi Akiba had all of these things sitting out before him, and through his work of scholarship and textual criticism, that science seeks to establish an accurate text by looking at all of these different sources, he came up with a standardized text around the year 100 AD. And it was so well received that it did become the standard by which all other manuscripts and all other texts were judged. And so if there was, for example, regardless of the translation, but for example, Rabbi Akiba's text varies somewhat from the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation. Well, the text that the Septuagint used was a little different than Rabbi Akiba's. And so Rabbi Akiba's text was so well received by the Jews that when that came about and then they looked at the Septuagint, it was considered to be inferior. And so any copies of the Septuagint or copies of the Hebrew text that the Septuagint came from was considered not worthy to be saved. And so they didn't recopy those. And they just kind of let them fall by. Any text that didn't fall in line with Rabbi Akiba's was allowed to fall by the wayside. So those are two of the main reasons why we don't have very many manuscripts. And the ones that we do have are, the extant manuscripts that we have are of such late date. When we look at the New Testament, okay, John did his writing, he wrote his gospel by most estimations around the year 90 AD. Well, we have a fragment of the book of John, the Gospel of John, that dates to 120 AD, 30 years later. I mean, we're talking going way back there. And it's just quite the opposite with the New Testament, or the Old Testament. Yeah.
Should we then consider the Septuagint to be inferior to the Masoretic text?
Well, it's inferior to the Masoretic text.
Simply because of the fact that it's a Greek translation of the Hebrew itself?
No, simply because it's a different text. That doesn't mean that it's inferior to the Masoretic, or let's don't use the word inferior, let's say different. It varies, it diverges. The Masoretic text is probably the most accurate, but there are places where the Septuagint text, and we'll get to this in the second half, there's places where we can even correct the Masoretic text by use of the Septuagint, even by use of the Samaritan text. There's times where the Samaritan text might correct some errors that might have come into the Masoretic over the years.
What year did this start?
Akiba, the date that's usually given is 100 AD. So, somewhere around the close of the first century. Now, his disciples, his followers from that time period on, and we'll talk about this more when we get into the Talmud and its origins, but they began this work of tradition. Now, okay, he started it with the standardization of the text. Then, after the dispersion, Israel's destroyed, temple's destroyed, Jerusalem's destroyed, and the Jews go all over the place. And they go to France, and they go to Turkey, and they go to Egypt, and they go to Babylon. They go all over the place, and they start speaking these other languages. Well, the Jewish scholars the Jewish rabbis, the leaders, were afraid that with Hebrew no longer being a vernacular tongue, no longer being a language that's spoken by the common Jew, they were speaking German and whatever the other languages were. And so they were afraid that without that, Hebrew is a language that is such, we all know that Hebrew doesn't use vowels. It's a consonantal language. It only has consonants. And it is of such a nature that if you speak the language, just like we speak English, well, if we spoke Hebrew, because of the nature of the language and the way the words are formed in the back of the throat, you don't have to have the vowels in order to read it. You know, if you know how to speak it, then the vowels just are formed by putting the consonants together, in other words, for the most part. And so that's not a problem. Reading Hebrew isn't a problem if you speak Hebrew. They were afraid that since people quit speaking Hebrew, that being able to read the Hebrew would die out. And then it would only be the sort of thing that only the scholars could do, you know. And that was a fear that was coming in with the Jewish leaders. And so the Masoretes began with Aqaba, and then as this tradition increased and kind of mushroomed following him, the primary work of the Masoretes were to come up with a system of little jots and tittles, so to speak. That wasn't what they were, but they were just little critical signs that would be above the letters or at the end of words or that sort of thing, that would serve along the lines of vowel points, punctuation points, you know, explanation, commas, and this sort of a thing. And it was just for the purpose of preserving the language so that it could be carried on even if the spoken language died out. Now that was their main purpose of the Masoretes. The most famous of all the Masoretes were the Ben Asher family, and they thrived around the 900 period, somewhere in there. We don't know really when they began, the Masoretes. I mean, most people try to trace them all the way back to Aqaba, but we don't really have a, you know, we had Rabbi Aqaba, and then a few centuries later you got the Masoretes. There's a definite tie, but there's a lot of missing links. And we can trace their activities back as far as the 6th, 7th century. And then they flourished on up to about the 10th or 11th century before they just kind of died away. The Ben Ashers were the ones that divided the Old Testament into verses. They were the first ones to do this. I read one place where it said that they are the same verse divisions that are used today. But then I've read several other places where it says, no, that the verse divisions that we use today didn't come about until the 15th century, 16th century. And so this is, you know, long after the Masoretes. So I'm not real sure about that. But they divided the Old Testament into 23,100 verses, which is a few hundred short of the Masoretic text that we use. There were two simultaneous parallel groups of Masoretes working at the same time. There was one that was centered around the Sea of Galilee called the Tiberian Masoretic tradition, and then there were those that were founded or centered in Babylon. Now, after the dispersion, the center of, ironically enough, the center of Judaistic scholarship was Babylon. And they had their tradition of these vowel points and the critical marks and so on, and then there was the one in Tiberias. And so they were working independently by and large, but simultaneously. And so, you know, there was this way of doing it over here with their vowel points and their exclamation points and so on, and then this way of doing it over here. There was a certain amount of let's kind of get together and let's travel back and forth and see what you're doing, and then we'll go do it. You know, a certain amount of that. But by and large, they were done independently. And so you have these two different traditions that are raised. And they developed some extremely intricate safeguards against errors. The joke of the day was that if anything could be counted, they'd count it. And they literally did that. They would count all of the letters in a book. You know, they'd take Isaiah, for example, and count all of the letters. And then they would find out what the middle letter of the whole book of Isaiah was. And then as their scribes were copying it down, he would go back and count all the letters. And if he didn't come up with that middle letter like they knew was the standard one, they tore it up and started all over again. And just anything like that that they could count, they would count. Just almost redundant type of safeguards to protect against errors. And that's one of the reasons why when we'll see in a little bit that when you just have just a handful of manuscripts that have survived, we can, you know, outside of the providence of the Holy Spirit, we can thank the Masoretes for it because of these safeguards that I'm sure those scribes, after working, you know, I mean, he's been 3 days on this one manuscript, and then he goes back and counts all the letters, and he's off by one letter, and he's got to tear it up and start all over again. He's probably thinking, man, you know, it wasn't that bad. And he probably wondered, you know, why do we have to have these safeguards? Well, you know, now in the 20th century, we can really thank them for it. Any questions over those? Guys, we'll be talking more about them later. Okay, Geniza. Now, most synagogues had built onto the side a little room that was known as the Geniza. Geniza is Hebrew for hiding place. And what they would do, you didn't have manuscripts that wore out every day in every synagogue, and so it was something that they would do periodically. As the manuscript wore out, they'd put it out in the Geniza, and it would just kind of like, it was the morgue, the manuscript morgue. And they would hold them there until after they had a few, and maybe on a certain festival or a certain, just at a certain time, when the time was right, then they would have this big party and they'd dig a hole and they'd bury the manuscripts. But in the meantime, they were kept in the Geniza. About 100 years ago, they were doing some excavations in Old Cairo and digging around the synagogue there in the old Jewish section of Old Cairo, and they uncovered the Geniza there. And they started digging around, and they found out that there was a bunch of manuscripts that had been in there for centuries and centuries and centuries that got overlooked. And, I mean, they put them in there to be buried, but then never buried them. And so that, before this time, all we had were these manuscripts that you saw at the top of your page. Well, here 100 years ago, they found this other cache. And so, oh, great, let's compare these to these have been laying there for hundreds of years, centuries and centuries. Let's compare them to the ones we have and see how they agree. And sure enough, they did. And interestingly enough, in this Cairo Geniza, they found there was also a copy of Ecclesiasticus, which is one of the apocryphal books, which was, odd to have that in a Hebrew Geniza, and also a copy of Origen's Hexapla. Now, we'll be talking about Origen and his Hexapla much more next week. But Origen was a Christian, and his work was for the sake of Christianity, and so it was kind of an interesting thing that a person such as Origen would have some of his work preserved in a Jewish synagogue. The Hexapla was the first parallel Bible. If you've ever seen a parallel Bible, it's where you have different columns. Each one of the columns has the same text in it, but it's maybe in a different translation. Well, that's what Origen did. He was a great scholar of around between the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 4th century. And we'll talk about his Hexapla more next week. Unfortunately, other than just little portions of it that we've been able to find, various fragmentary manuscripts, it hasn't survived. And that's not good news, really. Some of the other work that was done by the Masoretes was they introduced this practice of substitute pronunciation. They had what was known as the Ketib, which means the word that was written. If you remember, in the division of the Hebrew Bible, you had the Torah, which was the law, and then you had the prophets, which were however it's said, Netibim or something like that. And then you had the Ketubim, which were the writings. Well, the Ketib is the word that was written in these manuscripts. And then you had the Keri, Qere, and that was the word that was pronounced. There were certain times as they were, when they were having their synagogue service and the guy was standing up front and he would be reading from the manuscript, and he would come to a word that it was in the text, but when he spoke it, he wanted, for whatever reason, to pronounce something else. And they had a certain way of alerting that man that this was going to be the case. Don't pronounce the Ketib, pronounce the Keri. And there's a couple of good reasons as to why that was. One is, let's turn to Judges chapter 18. We'll show you one example of a substitute pronunciation. Judges chapter 18. Uh, 30. Who's got an NIV? Okay, Butch, why don't you read verse 30?
There the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of captivity of the land.
Okay, he said Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. Now, who's got a New American Standard or a New King James? Okay, Bill, why don't you read it?
Then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests of the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. Okay,
Butch read son of Moses. Bill read son of Manasseh. Which one is it? Of course, you can look over in my Bible has in the margin, it says that the Septuagint and the Vulgate read Moses. Well, actually, that's probably accurate. That's probably what the manuscript. In fact, all of the ancient witnesses point to that. But what happened was, Moses was who was cooler to the Jews than Moses? And so when they talked about Moses, they didn't want to say anything that would be considered to be derogatory or defamatory to Moses' name. Now, here's an example of some people setting up some carved images, and one of them is a descendant of Moses. And it wasn't like they were trying to deceive anybody. You know, they didn't want to make anybody think the wrong thing. But as they were reading this, they didn't want to say that Gershom was the son of Moses because Moses' name was held in veneration. And so what they would read instead, verbally, publicly, was the word Manasseh. Now, the way they did this, if I can use an English transliteration, to translate the word Moses from Hebrew, you would use these three consonants, MSH. The word Manasseh that's the difference between Moses and Manasseh. Now, if you remember, Manasseh was the guy, according to tradition, he's the one that had Isaiah sawn in half. So he wasn't a cool dude. And they didn't have too much problem using his name in a negative context. And so as they were going along and reading this, what they began doing was they would write the word Moses in the text like this, MSH, but then they would put that consonant there in between the M and the S and raise it up. And so they weren't trying to deceive anybody. As anybody's going along and read that, they would see that was Moses, but that would alert them to speak the Keri rather than the Kathib. And that was a common practice in those days. Another example is the tetragrammaton. If that's a 14, the tetragrammaton is a 14-letter word to describe a 4-letter word. And that 4-letter word is YHWH or YHVH. And that is those are the 4 consonants that are the name of God. When Moses said, "Who do I tell him sent me?" God said, YHWH. That's my name. Do not take my name, YHWH, in vain. And they took that seriously, especially after captivity. In fact, we are so afraid of taking the Lord's name in vain, probably the best way that we can avoid ever doing that is let's just don't ever say it. Let's don't ever say that name. And so whenever we come to but how can we avoid that when we're reading the scriptures publicly? And what if I'm going along and reading and I just haven't, been purified to the right degree or something, and I say his name and it's in vain, and then I'm going to incur the wrath. How can I avoid that? Well, when I come to that word, YHWH, I'll say something else rather than say that, and then I don't have to worry about it. And so for a period of time, initially, as they were doing that verbally, they would come to the word and then they would say Adonai, which is the Hebrew word for Lord. Or they would say Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God. And they would just try to speak about it generically and then go right on. But then as the tradition, the Masoretic tradition came in, well, how do we transliterate, or how do we copy this in the manuscripts? There came a point where I know what we'll do as they were putting down we're putting down these vowel points for all of the different consonants. What vowel points do we put down for this word? I know, let's take the vowel points from Adonai, and we'll insert those into the consonants of YHWH. And then they thought, yeah, that's a good idea. We don't have to worry about using it in vain. We'll just mispronounce it. We'll just say it wrong, and then we don't have to worry about it. And so that became a standardized way of doing it. And as William Tyndale, centuries later, was making his translation into English, it was from the Hebrew. That's what he had before him, was YHWH with the vowel points of Adonai, the resultant word being Jehovah. And from the Hebrew would be Yahweh. So we go back and we say, well, is Yahweh really the way it was pronounced? We really don't know, but there is some evidence. For example, the Samaritan Bible, we'll talk about that later, the Samaritans didn't have the same kind of hang-up about mispronouncing it and all of that. You know, they just figured as long as they didn't cuss, then they were okay. And so they weren't really that concerned about it, and so when they started, you know, using their vowel points and things, then that was a good way of going back and checking and seeing how accurate our pronunciation today is. And then plus the root, you know, the root of the word, what does the word mean? It means I am, or the existing one. And just what that word means in Hebrew is real similar to, it's like Yavah or something like that, Yavah. And so it's real similar as what we come up with Yahweh. So it's probably real close to the way it was actually pronounced, but we don't know. Any questions over that? Okay, reference division. Now, the reference divisions were fixed by the end of the Masoretic period. Prior to that time, they had sections. The Old Testament had been divided into sections. For example, let's turn real quick to Mark chapter 12. I think that's it. I was reading something real interesting today as it was discussing, 12:26. This is Jesus speaking, and he's making an allusion to the Old Testament, Mark 12:26, and he says, "But concerning the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the burning bush passage?" Well, I use the New King James, and it has italicized words, and the word burning and passage are italicized, which means they're not part of the Hebrew or the Greek. So read it without those. This is what it says. "But concerning the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." What Jesus was referring to was that this particular section of Exodus, where God spoke to Moses, was called the bush section. And they took the Torah and broke it down into these certain sections, and then gave each one of them a name. And this was called the bush section. Had nothing to do with present-day politics. Okay, but then the Masoretes came along, and they made it a little more convenient for reference, and they divided the whole Old Testament text into those 23,100 verses. They also were the first ones that began to take the text and break it down into paragraph form, according to the natural sense. As we know, Hebrew was just written out it's just like one long word. You know, no spaces, no punctuation or anything. And then the Masoretes were the ones that began to change that, and they did make the paragraph distinctions. They also broke it down into sections that were for the use of synagogue lessons, at least concerning the Pentateuch. They had two parts. There was the Sederim, which meant the certain order, and we'll talk about the Sederim of the Talmud later. This was in Palestine. They had broke it down into 154 lessons. They took the whole Torah, broke it down into 154 lessons, which gave them a 3-year cycle. So every 3 years on Saturday, they would end up reading the Torah. Now the Babylonians were a little more gung-ho about it, and they took the same thing and broke it into 54 lessons, so that every year they would read the 5 books of Moses as part of their Sabbath service. The chapter divisions are generally attributed, the current present-day chapter divisions are attributed to cardinal, sometimes you'll see his name written as Cardinal Hugo. The text used Cardinal Hugh of St. Cher, and I've seen him called Cardinal Hugh Cher, as just that being his last name. I don't think he's any relation. This was around AD 1244 when the chapter divisions came. And then the present day, as I said, I've read where the Rabbi Mordecai Nathan is the guy who's attributed to the present day verse divisions, and this was done 1400, sometime in the 15th century. But then I've read other places where it says that the Masoretes were the ones that did the same one that they did, so I don't know. Okay, the purity of the manuscripts. If we've only got a few of them, then how come it's so trustworthy? How can we say that this is the Word of God and that we can stand on it and everything? Well, for one thing, that tradition of the Masoretes, they were just so meticulous and in their safeguards. They didn't change the consonantal text. They took Rabbi Akiba and they said, okay, Rabbi Akiba has done a good thing. We don't mess with good things. And so they took his text and they were slavish in their endeavors to keep that pure. And, you know, with all of their safeguards and everything. So they didn't change the text at all. All they did was introduce some various pronunciation aids. And so that's the first one. Just their adherence to keeping it the way it was. The second one was the way it was. The text of Rabbi Akiba. His text being the ancestor of the Masoretic, and just like I said, when he had completed his work, then that was just considered to be it. And so that was done 2,000 years ago. All of the manuscripts that have come down to us since that time use that text as the standard. Okay, number 3, the Mishnah. If you turn on your outlines to the back page, is where it says Rabbinic Writings. Look here in the center where it says Babylonian Talmud. That would be primarily what we're concerned with right now. You've probably heard of the word Talmud. The Talmud is a very voluminous collection of writings that date from, they go back to the exile with Ezra and Nehemiah as far as the oral tradition. Remember, Jesus spoke a lot about the oral tradition, and it had its beginnings way back with Ezra and Nehemiah, and then around the time of Akiba, that oral tradition began to be committed to writing. And then by the end of the 2nd century, primarily under the work of a guy by the name of Rabbi Judah. He's sometimes called Judah the Prince, Judah the Patriarch. You see him down here at the bottom of your page. He's called Judah Hanasi. He was the one who took all of these oral traditions and got it written down, and at least oversaw that work. And this became known as the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah was broke down. Sometimes I'll be reading along in a commentary, especially dealing with the Old Testament, and you'll see the word tractate, and then it'll be a reference, and it'll say tractate 5, or tractate, and then the name, and then section so and so on. And I wondered what that is. I didn't know. Well, I found out that it has to do with the Mishnah. The Mishnah was broke into 6 sections. And each one of the sections was like 6 topical sections. One would be dealing specifically with things. The title of it was women. That was the title of the section. And it would deal with things like marriage, childbearing. This is where the guys, Hillel and all of the great rabbis and their teachings on divorce and what constituted divorce. Well, this was all contained in that particular section. And then there was a section just on agricultural laws. There was a section dealing with civil disputes between individuals and so on. All of this was contained in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was basically an interpretation of the Old Testament, to put it simply. And then of these 6 sections, there were a total of 63 tractates. They were like subdivisions that where it was broken down into for reference purposes. Okay, this worked okay, but then time went on and time went on, and they kept coming up with questions. Well, like what does the Mishnah have to do, say, about this particular subject or this particular subject? And they would look and they'd say, well, that's kind of a gray area. We don't know. And so a rabbi would make a ruling. Well, I believe that, you know, the Mishnah would address this subject in this particular manner. And then over a period of time, there became more of these rulings or commentaries on what the Mishnah would have said than what the Mishnah actually said. And they ended up they started committing that to writing. And they ended up having more of what became known as the Gemara, which were simply commentaries on the Mishnah than they had of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was commentaries on the Bible. And so the two together, the Mishnah and the Gemara, ended up being like 70 volumes, you know, just a whole library in and of themselves of simply commentary on the Old Testament. This is where, like the example Don's used, where they came up with the question, what do we do with an egg that a hen lays on the Sabbath? You know, I mean, this is obviously labor. And so what do we do? I mean, but it's a good egg, you know, good Jewish mentality. This is a good egg, so what do I do with it? And so they deliberated, and they came up with the idea, well, I know it wouldn't be lawful for us to eat it because it was produced through labor, but we can sell it to a Gentile. And so these are the type of things that came from the Talmud. Now, there is multi-references to the Old Testament in these writings. They quote from it profusely. And so this provides a good witness to the text of the Old Testament. So we can look at the Talmud, which has, you know, they copied these. We got all kinds of old ancient manuscripts of the Talmud. And so we can look at those, see their quotations, and then compare that against these manuscripts that we have and see that it's pure. Origen's Hexapla. Again, we're going to talk more about that next week. Basically, let me just go into it briefly. The Hexapla was a 6-column work. Over here was a copy of Rabbi Akiba's text in Hebrew. Okay. Here was a transliteration of that Hebrew text into Greek. Now, if you don't know, and then these were some various other versions and translations in the Greek. There was Theodotion's, Symmachus, his own, Aquila's, and we'll go into that next week. But if you don't understand the difference between a translation and a transliteration, maybe this will put it simply. Okay, this is Greek for Logos. This is written out in Greek. That's not a translation. That's not a transliteration. That's just Greek. That's Greek for Logos. This is a transliteration of Greek into English. Okay, it's still the same word. That's a foreign word to us. If we didn't know what that word was, it doesn't mean anything to us. That's a translation. Okay, this is a translation of this word into English. This is a transliteration of this word into English. So the first column was Hebrew. The second column was a transliteration of the Hebrew into Greek. And then the other 5 columns, or the other 4 columns, were translations of the Hebrew into Greek. Okay? That was Origen's Hexapla. Like I said, by and large, it's been lost. But we do have portions of it, and this provides a very good witness to the purity of the text, because we know it was based strictly on Akiba's text within about a century after he had finished it. The Aramaic Targums, we're going to talk about Targums next week. The word Targum means translation. And we'll talk more about them next week. So these were translations of the Hebrew text into Aramaic, which was the first language that the Old Testament was translated into. And then we have Aquila's Greek version. Now, I mentioned him in passing a minute ago, and we're going to talk more about these guys next week. I'm just kind of throwing their names out so you'll become familiar with them. This isn't the Aquila and Priscilla fame. This is another guy. He was a Gentile converted to Judaism, And he took, the Septuagint is in disrepute now with the Jews. You know, for one thing, Christians like it. So anything Christians like, Jews don't like, so the Septuagint's out, and we don't use it anymore, we throw it away. But they still spoke Greek, and so they had a problem. But we need a Greek translation. What do? Well, Aquila took Agabus' text and translated it into Greek. So the Septuagint used a different text, but Aquila used Agabus' text. There were several guys that did that, by the way, as we'll see in Origen's Hexapla, but Aquila was the one and he was slavishly literal, because the whole thing, that, you know, the mentality then was the Septuagint was done under kind of a Hellenistic mindset, you know, with that was everybody, you know, the Hellenistic Jews and everything. Well, in Aquila's time, he says, no, we got to go back to the faith of our fathers. And so it was slavishly literal to Hebrew, even to the point of being awkward when you tried to read it in Greek. He did things like when he came to the word Yahweh, YHWH, in the Hebrew, he didn't even transliterate that. He didn't translate it or anything. He just wrote it out in the square Hebrew, which led to some confusion later. Some of the other versions that point to a witness to the purity of the text, we got the Septuagint. We can compare the Septuagint with the text that we use today and see how they line up. The Samaritan Bible, as I said. The Syriac version, which was the first language that the Bible as a whole was translated into, out of the Greek and Hebrew, was Syriac. And we have those that have, in various forms and versions, have come down to us today, and they provide a witness. And then also the Latin Vulgate, which goes back, you know, if the manuscripts that we have, the manuscripts we have don't go older than the 9th century, then the Vulgate goes much older than that. So we can look at some of these old Latin Vulgate manuscripts, and they provide a witness. Any question? Okay, after the break, we'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we'll see the greatest witness for the purity of the Old Testament text as we discuss that. Let's go ahead and take a break, and then we'll come back afterwards. All right, before the break, we were talking about the Old Testament manuscripts. And now let's begin with letter F, number F, on your outlines, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, right about the time when things were really starting to happen in the Middle East with the recognition of the State of Israel and everything prior or after World War II, there was a Bedouin shepherd boy who was out tending his flocks one day, and not much to do, so he picked up a rock and he threw it in a cave that was kind of across the way, and when it went in, he heard it clunk, kind of a hollow, dull sound, so he went to go investigate. And what he found when he did was what most scholars have said without reservation or hesitation at all, the greatest archaeological find of all time. It began a period of about 10 years of excavations in this area. There's several hundred caves within just like walking distance of this area that has become known as the Dead Sea area. It's in an area that is known by the word, there was a community of people there known as Qumran. Qumran, Qumran community. And as I said, there's several hundred caves, but of these several hundred, they found within 11 of them all kinds of artifacts, primarily ancient manuscripts, over 600 pieces of literature, whether they were just fragmentary or entire manuscripts. There's over 600 pieces of literature there, 200 of which are manuscripts of parts of the Old Testament. And that was great in and of itself, that they were able to find something very old and very prolific and very vast. But what was really great was when they started checking out how old this stuff was. They found out that it was just by far older than anything they had ever had heretofore. And that just it really set the whole biblical world upside down. For example, in Cave 1, they found a complete scroll of Isaiah. It has, in fact, they found two scrolls, Isaiah A and Isaiah B. But one is a complete scroll in very, very preserved condition that has become known as Isaiah A, the Isaiah A scroll from Cave 1. When W.F. Albright, who is probably the best archaeologist of this century, when he examined it, he said without hesitation that it had to date prior to the 1st century B.C. So I mean, he's putting it into the 2nd century B.C. He said there's no doubt about it. It has to be at least that old. Just the ramifications of that find itself was enough to make headlines, because prior to this time there was becoming a very prevalent school of thought among liberal Christianity that the book of Isaiah, because of all of its messianic prophecies, Isaiah 7:14, Isaiah 53, and so on, it had to have been written after Jesus. There were certain parts of it that were written after Jesus and then added to it, and then a few centuries down the line nobody knew the difference anyway, and they just called that Isaiah, who lived a long time ago. And that was becoming a very prevalent thought. Well, because at least 200 years before Christ, here is not only a copy of a copy of a copy of something like, as is the case of the Septuagint, we had the real thing. I mean, here was a manuscript that had been laying in that cave for centuries by some people who cared nothing for Christianity. And it was just when they took Isaiah A and they rolled it out and laid it beside the Isaiah of the Masoretic text, it was just almost word for word. I mean, it just the amount of agreements is just phenomenal. They also found, as I said, the other Isaiah scroll. They found 2 chapters of the first 2 chapters of the book of Habakkuk, and fragments of all books of the Old Testament with the exception of Esther. And then, of course, they started sneaking around in some of the other caves, and they found all kinds of things. Primarily, the 3 most prolific works they found, above all else, was the book of Isaiah, the Psalms, and Deuteronomy. Those were the 3 favorite. But they found parts of all books except Esther. And of course, someone could jump up and say, aha, see, I knew Esther shouldn't have been in the Bible. That doesn't mean that at all. At the very most, what that means is that these guys at Qumran didn't think it should be. But it doesn't even mean that. It just means that there's no copies of Esther for 2,000 years. There could have been some that have been destroyed, for all we know. Yes, Patty?
How much of Psalms and Deuteronomy were in the complete books?
Yeah, they were able to. Now, I don't know that they had a complete book of Deuteronomy in any one, in any one scroll that was the whole thing. But that maybe they'd have the first half here, and over here they'd find another manuscript that had the second half. So they were able to put it together. There was a lot of that sort of thing. Simply stated. I don't know what they had as far as, they found one scroll that was made completely out of copper. It's called the copper scroll. And it was so oxidized that they couldn't unroll it, and so they built a saw. I mean, it was like they invented a saw just for the purpose of cutting this thing open. They just cut right through the middle of it so that then they could take the little pieces and lay them side by side. That was the only way they could read it. And I mean, I've seen photographs. They built rooms, they built buildings just for the purpose of taking these scrolls and unrolling them. With the perfect scientific conditions and things like this. And they might have a scroll that they would spend years using certain agents and things like this on it. They would spend years just getting the thing unrolled and getting it treated, reagents that would bring the writing back and so on. It wasn't the sort of thing like they just pulled the rubber band off of them and then I mean, it's really cool the way and there's still not all of the findings have been published yet. You know, even 40 years later, they're still doing work. So it was a great find. I mean, it has not been even come close to equaled since. I can remember in grade school back in the 50s and reading about this sort of thing in our weekly readers, because they were just starting to come up with publishing, and you were in high school, I know, Butch. They were just starting to publish their findings then, back in the middle 50s, and I remember reading about it even back then. Now, basically they come in 3 different time periods. There's what's known as the Archaic period. And this is from 200 to 150 BC. And they can be pretty precise, and there's various ways, and we'll get to that in a minute. Then there's what's known as the Hasmonean period, or Hasmonean. And this is from 150 to, we'll say, actually 37 BC would be accurate. That's when Mark Antony executed the last Hasmonean king. This was the period that you read about in 1 Maccabees. This is the period of time between the Testaments when the Syrians were ruling in Palestine, and then Judas Maccabeus, and he was a pious priest of that day, and he and his sons rose up in revolt, and they overthrew Antiochus Epiphanes, drove him out of the country, and for a brief period of time, for a period of approximately 100 years, there was just real short time where there was a semblance of autonomy. I mean, they had this Hasmonean dynasty, and they set up a king, and his son took the throne after him, and so on down to I forget what the last king's name was, but then the Romans came in and they killed him, and they set up Herod the Great. The Herod that was the Herod the Great at Jesus' birth. Herod the Great married Mariamne, which was the sister of the last Hasmonean king. And that was his, so that he could validate his claim to the throne. He wasn't Jew, you see. But by marrying her, then he could say, well, since I'm royalty now, since I married her. And so this is the Hasmonean period. And then there is the Herodian period, which followed that. And this would go from, I think it was like 32, I think it was 32 BC. So this would actually go to 32 BC. And then this was from 32 BC to AD 70. 32 BC to AD 70. This was known as the Herodian period. And all of these manuscripts, along with the other finds, fall into those 3 categories. Now, the various evidences that they used to date these, they took some of the linen. These scrolls were not just kind of laying over in a pile. By and large, they were wrapped in linen and then put down in clay pots. And that's what, when the Bedouin shepherd boy threw the rock in the cave, that he hit one of those clay pots. And so that's how they were stored. That's why they were in such good shape after all these thousands of years. That's why they were so preserved, because they were, they were put in linen, put inside the clay jar, and then in a very arid climate. So they took some of this linen that was wrapped around him and used radiocarbon dating method on them. And by that, which is not very exact, that kind of gives you ballpark figures sometimes. It's not a really exact science. And those data, they assumed, or they were able to figure that from that, these linens dated from 175 BC. This is the ballpark, from 175 BC to 225 AD, somewhere in that 350-year period. That's from that. Now, paleographic, that might be a new word for you. Paleography is a science the paleographic method is they would look at the words themselves. Look at the style of writing, and they can date things by looking at that. Now, if that sounds kind of weird to you, if you look in a you know, if you've got any old books at home, and you open up the book, and on the inside page where someone writes to so-and-so with love from so-and-so or something, and maybe this book is 100 years old, and you look at that writing, or maybe you've seen, you know, an old letter from, look at the Constitution, the handwriting that was used in the Constitution 200 years ago. That's English that those guys were writing. But their style of forming the letters and everything has changed dramatically in 2 centuries. You look a century ago, you look at the way people wrote in English a century ago, and it's changed a lot. Even people that you know, maybe use the Roman alphabet, and, you know, like Germans, French, and so on, that use by and large the same alphabet we do, with the exception of a letter or two, they write differently than we do. The way they form the letters and their cursive and everything, their style, a German writes different than an American does, even with all the differences in handwriting. Well, this is what's known as paleographic method. And this was the thing that W.F. Albright, I mean, he was the prince of this. He was probably the greatest ever in looking at writings and being able to date them just simply from paleography. And probably this was one of the most accurate. In fact, he said that all competent students of writing conversant with the available material and with paleographic method date the scrolls in the years, date the scrolls within the 250 years before 70 A.D. So he says I mean, that's the very newest they could be, is 70 A.D. And everybody that knows anything about what we're talking about tonight, all of them that are competent in any way, shape, or form, go from that point back 250 years. And he just placed his whole reputation on the fact that Isaiah A was before 100 BC. Now, the interesting thing about this is W.F. Albright, in the earlier part, see, he died a few years ago, back in the, I don't know, decade or so ago. Late 60s, early 70s, somewhere in there. And early in his career, he was a liberal. And, you know, he was raised in this whole liberal school, and he went to Israel as a liberal, and longer he stayed there in Israel and Egypt and different parts of the Middle East, being the world's greatest archaeologist and digging up all of these cool things, the more conservative he got. And the more he began to see, man, the Bible's really what it claims to be. And then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, he just goes, whoa. And probably one of the greatest means that we have of dating the scrolls is the fact that they weren't the only things in the jars. They had coins in there too. And coins have dates on them too. Just like the coins we use today, coins are, you know, they've always been dated. And so coins would be right in the jars with the, you know, they just, somebody's pocket change fell out. And it'd be right in there with the scrolls, and that's one of the other ways that they have of dating them. Now, interestingly enough, and I think this is really interesting, it's generally believed that these people that lived at Qumran, and this is just simply a conjecture, but it's generally, most scholars believe, at least a good possibility, that the people that lived at Qumran were a group of people known as the Essenes. Essenes. Now, Josephus talks about these guys, Philo talks about them, Pliny the Younger talks about them, a bunch of Jewish historians. And these were a group of people that saw what was happening in Jerusalem. They saw what was happening with, on one hand, you have the Hellenization of the Jewish culture, where they were all, you know, just beginning to take in Greek philosophy and all of that. On the other hand, you got the Sadducees, who were just basically the liberal atheists and didn't really believe anything about the Bible anyway, and they were the political leaders. And then on the other hand, you got the religious, pious Pharisees. And they saw this and they go, man, this is junk. We don't want nothing to do with this. We're going to go out in the desert and be monks. And so that's what they did, and they just lived out in the middle of the desert and started this very ultra fundamental, conservative, let's not have anything to do with the world community, known as the Essenes. And so most people believe that that was, one of these communities was located at Qumran. A very good possibility. The significance of that is that within the finds of the Dead Sea area, they come up with 3 different texts. three different texts. Not tests, but texts that were found at Qumran. Now remember I said last week, when we talk about text, we're talking about the words themselves and how they relate to each other. You know, the text is, the Masoretic text is this particular set of words. The Septuagint text would be another particular set of words. And they don't exactly line up word for word all the way through from Genesis to Malachi. Okay, well at Qumran there were three texts. First one is a text that was very similar and probably the one that the Septuagint was based on. And remember I said that after Aqaba, when he standardized his text, then everything else was left to go to the wayside. Well, this was one of them. The Septuagint and its text was considered to be no good by the Jews. But at Qumran, they found a lot of their writings were very similar to what we know today as what came from the Septuagint. The second one is one that was very close to what we call today as the Masoretic text, which was the forerunner of which was Rabbi Akiba's text. And so there is a textual tradition or a textual family that is woven through some of the manuscripts found at Qumran that was very likely that textual tradition that Akiba used when he did his work in 100 AD. Okay? So here, these are two divergent texts. And interestingly enough, the third text was very, very similar to what the Samaritan Pentateuch is based on, which is extremely significant when you think that these were a bunch of very conservative, right-wing, fundamental, let's go live in the desert and be monk Jews that thought that the Jewish church had gone clear left-wing. But at Qumran, these guys were using indiscriminately, it would appear, three different types of texts and not having any problem with it. Now that's extremely significant to me today, living in the 20th century, when you begin to investigate the controversy that goes on today between New American Standard and the New King James and the NIV and all this sort of thing. You know, I mean, there are people that write volumes of work trying to put down one of the other Bibles. I had a woman call the church here a couple of months ago. She had seen our little brochure on what is Calvary Chapel and thought it was really great, and she was wanting to come and check us out one Sunday. She said, I just got one question. Do you use the Bible Paul used? And she said this, literally, she said that. Do you use the Bible Paul used? I knew exactly what she meant. But I said yes, because we do. And as we talked longer about that, of course, her case became more and more clear. And she said, well, I could never go to your church then. I mean, that was more important to her than whether we believe Jesus was God, whether he died for sins and rose from the dead. Did we use the King James Bible? That was her big thing. Well, okay, but we can see here that these guys, 2,000 years ago, as conservative and right-wing and fundamental and independent and just totally removed from everybody else as they could be, they didn't have that hang-up. And that's probably a lesson, regardless of some of their shortcomings, that's probably a lesson we can learn from them. And that's also going to be a test question. Okay, any questions over the Dead Sea? Yes, Don?
Several. Is it true that there are, I don't know what the number are, but perhaps even hundreds of scrolls that haven't been opened yet? And are those biblical ones or just the other ones? And what are the other ones for sure?
Okay. Of the 600, only 200 were biblical.
Okay, period.
So 400 are extra biblical, which might sound like a large, comparison. But this was a library. If you were to go into my library, I don't have near that ratio of Bibles compared to other books. And if you were to go to the Better Book Room, it'd be the same sort of thing. So it was just simply a library, and they had all their Chuck Swindoll and John MacArthur and everything there too.
So their commentaries, their religious writings, their secular writings.
Yeah, a lot of they had a manual of discipline that was very predominant too, and this was basically the code of ethics for this community. talking about how, I mean, these guys were into baptizing. In fact, there are some people that believe that this might be where John the Baptist got his, wild locust and leather belt. That he was raised in this community, and then, the baptism of John, he just carried that in. I mean, these guys, they had these big baptismals every place, and they were into it. They'd do it 3 or 4 times a day. Every time they had a bad thought, they'd go get dunked, and it was just this whole baptism unto repentance mentality. And so they had a lot of books about that.
Okay, the second question was then, if these Old Testament discoveries dating before 70 A.D. are valid and all that, don't they sort of outweigh any of these other Old Testament manuscript finds of the 900s and 1000s?
The big clincher is that there's nothing to outweigh. When you lay them side by side textually, I mean, there is just as much agreement between the Masoretic family of texts that were found at Qumran as there is between the Codex of the Prophets in Leningrad and the Codex of Aleppo, which are within 100 years of each other.
But then how come they're not listing the most famous and most
Well,
important?
because these are the ones that have, I mean, these are the manuscripts, and we've had those for the last 1,000 years. The ones from the Codex or the Cairo Geniza I didn't list either, because these are all from this century. And so this century they have done all kinds of things, but they carry the same weight or equal weight.
Okay, and then the last question, maybe a two-parter. On the Geniza, that's difficult for me to believe there was a hexapla there too in a Jewish synagogue. And if that's true, is there any truth to that story that the scribes, before writing the name, would have to go and do their ritual bathing and all that stuff, new quill and paper and all that, just to write the name?
There was something to that. Now, I don't know how extent that was and how diverse that was. Whether it would be at every center that they went to that extreme. But they all had that type of reverence. I just don't know how far they carried it. And yeah, Butch and I were talking during the break, and the only thing we can figure is that, well, they were Egyptian and we know how liberal they were. I don't know. I think it's kind of strange too. The only thing it could have been that just simply because the scholarship was that good that they recognized the scholarship, if nothing else. Because see, the work that he did of the hexapla, all of the work was done by, each column was done by a Jew except his. He was the only Christian column. Symmachus and Theodotion and Aquila and all those guys were Jews, as well as Akiba and everything else. So the only thing that was really non-Jewish in it was his transliteration, which is basically safe because it was came straight over from Akiba's text.
And it was all Old Testament.
Yeah, the whole thing was Old Testament. They didn't have any New Testament writings in it.
There's no chance that some Christian group inhabited that synagogue.
Oh, I suppose that has happened down through the centuries from time to time. Yeah, that's probably a good point, good possibility.
But then, of course, the other Hebrew writings, maybe they would have collected some more Christian writings and put them in there in addition to the hexapla.
Yeah, and the Christians weren't into using Genizas. Unless maybe it was just an old forgotten room, and I don't know.
Okay.
There's a book by the name by Paul Kahle, I think how it's pronounced, Kahle, called the Cairo Geniza. It's a whole book that's just published on the finds that they got there. And he's a guy that just died recently too. He was another one of the great Egyptologists and Hebraist of this century. Okay, any others? Patty?
They searched out all the caves already.
Yeah, I don't think they're finding anything else, but they haven't published. Another one of Don's questions were have they opened them all? I don't know.
I was just reading recently in the paper that there's some people, the Hebrew University has them, and they're not giving them up. And there's some people really angry because they won't, they refuse to let them open them under any other conditions than their own strict, and they've got they got them locked up.
Yeah, I believe that to be
true. I'm just wondering what all we're not seeing that still, 40 years later has been hidden from us.
Yeah. I don't think there's that much, but there is. I don't think it's all. Like I said, I know it hasn't all been published. Okay. The lost books of the Old Testament. Now, you go down to Kmart and you go over to the discount book rack. You know, they got the table over there where everything's marked off 60%. And you'll see a stack of books over there that's called the Lost Books of the Bible. Okay, that sounds very clandestine and very romantic and very intriguing. So you go over and you pick it up and you find out, well, what are the lost books of the Bible? And you'll find out when you do that they are neither. They're neither lost nor are they of the Bible. They're just simply writings that are from antiquity that, you know, had some sort of religious connotation that somebody, in order to, you know, we'll call these the lost books of the Bible, and then we'll sell a lot of them. But there is what is known, or what we could phrase as the lost books of the Old Testament. They are books that are mentioned within the borders of the Old Testament that are not extant. So we could say they're lost, and we say they're of the Bible because they came from the Bible. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's turn to Numbers chapter 21. And this isn't really important, this section that we're getting into now. I mean, it's not real significant that we need to have a real good handle on. But you'll see these mentions. I mean, you're reading along, and you'll run across the books of the Words of the Lord, and you'll say, well, what's that? I never heard of that. And so we'll just take a couple of minutes to look into that, and that'll be it. Okay, verse 14. Now this is, it says, therefore it is said in the book of the Words of the Lord, and then these guys and the Brooks and Arnon, and then he quotes here, you know, the last half of 14 and verse 15. He's quoting from what he calls the book of the Words of the Lord. This is the only place I know of that it's mentioned in the Bible, and it's generally believed that this was a compilation of this is kind of a song. It's written out here in a, some sort of a poetic fashion. And so it was believed by most scholars that the book of the Words of the Lord were a compilation of the escapades of Israel as they were going across Sinai, and possibly even in some of their things that they went into on the other side of the Jordan. Just a collection of war songs. Some believe that the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 6 might also be part of the book of the Wars of the Lord. We don't know. It hasn't come down. It's not extant. We don't see very many references to it, and this is the only one in Scripture. Okay, the book of Jasher. Many references to the book of Jasher in Scripture. We'll just give a few of them. It's believed primarily the book of Jasher was a collection of poetry written. It's a history of the important parts of Israel, their events, their escapades, all the things, just the big significant events. Someone would write a poem about it and then put it in the book of Jasher. And it was just kind of something that they kept back at the archives. Joshua chapter 10, verse 12 and 13, where God made the sun and the moon stop. So Joshua was running out of daylight, and so he made the sun and the moon stop so they could go ahead and whoop up on the guys. Well, it says that this was recorded in the book of Jasher. 2 Samuel 1, 17 to 27, after David found out about Saul and Jonathan and he did his big lament, well, that lament was included in the book of Jasher. 1 Kings 8, verse 12 and 13, when they were ready to dedicate the temple, Solomon's temple. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you were to look this up, unless you're using the Septuagint, well, let's go ahead and turn to it. We got time. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 8. I've got a notation in the footnote of my Bible. Possibly you do too. Chapter 8, verse 12 and 13. Then Solomon spoke, and the Lord said he would dwell in the dark cloud. I have surely built you an exalted house and a place for you to dwell forever. You see how in my Bible, in the New King James, this kind of shows this as a song. It shows it written out in a poetic fashion. Well, I thought mine had a footnote to this. It doesn't. But in the Septuagint, I was showing the 3 different textual traditions that they found at Qumran. Well, in the Septuagint, there at the end of verse 13 it says, and this song of Solomon's is recorded in the book of Jasher. Well, it wasn't in the Masoretic text, that other family, but it was in the Septuagint. And then I said Judges 6 earlier, Judges 5 for the Song of Deborah. Possibly this is also something that was included in the book of Jasher, or possibly the book of the Wars of the Lord. Because this was, a significant event in Israel, that they recorded their significant events in the book of Jasher, and also it was the song of one of their victories. And so maybe it could have been in both of those books. Although we don't have reference to that. Okay, see, the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. Now, as you're reading along in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, you'll find reference. It'll say something about King Hodad, and he'll say, King Hodad and the rest of his works, are they not found in the book of the Kings of the Chronicles of Judah? And when I was a young believer, and I'd be reading that, and I'd go, well, I don't know. So I'd turn over to 1st or 2nd Chronicles and try to find what else it had to say about King Hodad, and there wasn't anything, And I thought this was reference to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and it's not. In fact, as I found out, later on, that 1st and 2nd Chronicles was probably not even written until after they came back from exile. And a lot of people believe that Ezra wrote them. So when we read in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and they make reference to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, or the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah and Israel, that's not what they're talking about. Okay? Totally lost, y'all? What these are referring to are the standard, the official annals of the court record. The book of 1st and 2nd Samuel and the book of 1st and 2nd Kings are basically what God wanted us to know about King Hodad. And that's what he communicated, and how King Hodad fit into his redemptive plan. All right? That's why it was preserved in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel. That wasn't everything that was written down about Hodad, though. There might have been a whole lot of other things that would be the typical, how many baby dedications he did, and how many, ribbon cutting ceremonies, and all these sort of things that the kings did in those days. They would make the official record, but they didn't need to put it down in 1st and 2nd Samuel, because that didn't have anything to do with God's redemptive purpose. And so basically, that was something that was kept down at the courthouse on the microfiche. And so when you wanted to find out, but what this is really saying is that if you want to know more about, when you run into one of those passages and it says, are not, the doings of King Hodad in the Kings of the Chronicles of the King of Judah, it basically what it's saying is go down to the courthouse. If you want to know more, you go down to the courthouse and then look it up on the computer. Okay, so that's really what those are all about. It's the court annals of the two kingdoms. Okay, a few other lost books. Now these are mentioned in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You have 1st Chronicles 27:24 mentions the Chronicles of King David, which were probably, his own specific microfiche. And then you also, in 1st Chronicles 29:29, there's 3 references to some other official records of David. Evidently, he had more than one. And 1 Chronicles 29:29 mentions 3. You've got the history of Samuel the seer, which is probably Samuel the seer. And then you've got the history of Nathan the prophet. He's the guy that busted David for what he did. And then you have the history of Gad the seer. And 1 Chronicles 29:29 just makes a reference to, well, all of the events of David were, you can go read these 3 books if you want to find out more. And then the same thing with Solomon in 2 Chronicles 9:29. You have the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite and the visions of Edu the seer. Iddo, and Ahijah. Ahijah the Shilonite and Iddo the seer. And these are the official records of Solomon. And if you don't get those down, they're in your text. It's not that important. You do need to know what the book of the Words of the Lord and the book of Jasher was. The rest of these are insignificant. Any questions over that? Okay, the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans have their Bible. As you know, I've made a couple of references to it earlier. Now, a lot of people will be, they'll be reading along in the book of John, and they'll come to chapter 4, and they'll, Jesus, went to the well, and this Samaritan, I must needs go through Samaria. And then this woman comes, and you have this conversation between Jesus and her, and you see that there is a lot of animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. And people say, well, who are the Samaritans? And then later on, Jesus gives the parable about who's my neighbor, and he talks about the Good Samaritan. And so someone said, well, who are the Samaritans? Where did they come from? And why is there this animosity between the Jews and them? Basically, Israel was always, at least in heart, it was always a divided nation. From the time that they crossed the Jordan, they never did really, there was the northern tribes never really got along with the southern tribes. And in all of the history, from the time of Joshua until the time of Nebuchadnezzar, there was really only a real brief period in their history where they could be considered a united nation or a united kingdom. And that was under, sort of under Saul, but not really, and then David and Solomon, during the reign of David and Solomon. And that was the only time they were really united, and even then it was kind of there was friction. It just never was a real tight thing like where, they considered themselves to be buds. Okay, so Solomon dies. Solomon dies, and his son, Rehoboam, comes to the throne. Well, the guys from the northern kingdom come up to him, and they said, Rehoboam, your dad kind of treated us a little harder than what he treated the Judans, the guys down south. And we'd like to know right now, before we go any further with this, what's going to be your posture? How are you going to treat us? How are you going to tax us? What kind of a relationship are we going to have? So Rehoboam goes back to Solomon's advisors, and he sits down with them, and he says, well, what should I go tell these guys? They're waiting for an answer. And so the guy said, well, I think you ought to go back to him, or we think you ought to go back to him and tell him, you're right. Dad was a little hard on you, but, you and I, we're going to get along, and it's going to be different with us. Let's reign in peace. And he goes, oh, okay. So he's going along, and then he calls some of his buddies, some from his generation, some of his younger guys over there, and he calls them, and he asks them the same thing. He said, well, what should I go tell them? And he said, well, I'll tell you what you ought to go tell them. You ought to go tell them, if you think Dad was hard on you, you ain't messed with nobody yet. And I'm going to show you what taxes are all about. Get out of my face. And so Rehoboam goes, okay, that sounds better to me. So he goes back to him, and that's what he tells them the next day. And so they said, well, what have we got to do with you? Bag it, Rehoboam. And they took the general of the army, Jeroboam, and said, how would you like to be king? And he said, oh, okay. So they take him back with them, and they just started another country. They had just like, they seceded from the Union and went up north and started another country and called it Israel. And then the southern nation was called Judah. Okay, and then we know the history from that point forward, how they had basically two countries. Now, all of the Israelite kings, all of the kings of the northern tribes, every one of them were always bad guys. They were always idolaters. Jeroboam went up there and see they were no longer in Jerusalem, so they did have a temple, so the first thing he did was build a temple. In fact, he built two of them. He built two places of worship. He built some golden calves, and he said, okay, here's Jehovah, and we'll make it convenient for you. You guys up north can go there, and you guys down south can come here. And then all of the kings after him were that way. Okay, the King Omri, who was the father of Ahab, this is a couple centuries later, sometime around 800, I'm not sure the exact date, 800 BC. King Omri decided that he was going to establish the nation's capital. The capital of Israel was going to be located in the city of Samaria. And then within a short period of time, that became a generic term for the whole nation. It was called the nation of Samaria. And so that's where the term came from. Then a few kings later, they just kept getting worse and worse. And so in 732 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III, this is not real important unless you're just interested in history, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III came down and conquered the northern part of the northern kingdom. Okay, he didn't get all the way down, but he conquered the northern part and took a lot of those people off into captivity. Then he died, and there was one or two weak kings in between. And then 11 years later, in 721 BC, Sargon II, one of Tiglath-Pileser's successors, came to the throne. He came down against Israel, the northern kingdom again, and laid hold a Mondo siege against the city. I mean, just it went on for a long, long time. And this is where you read about this, and where, you know, like they were eating each other's babies and donkeys' heads and just whatever they could get a hold of, you know, because they laid this siege on the city. They laid this siege on the city, and the people just, you know, they ran out of food. And finally they gave up, and so Sargon came in and they carried everybody off into captivity. Well, the Assyrian way of doing things in those days was you carry the indigenous people off to your country, displace them, and then you take your people and colonize them. Send your people down there to colonize, and then everything will be cool. Well, this is what he did, but then the Bible says that the Lord was sending lions to harass the people. And so the Assyrians were down there, and they got to thinking, something ain't right, you know, and so I know we must have offended the God of this country. So they wrote back to Assyria, and it says, tell you what, why don't you send a few priests back down here? They'll tell us how to worship the way that we're supposed to appease the gods of this country, and then we won't have these lions messing with us anymore. So they did that, and the priests came back down there. Now remember, these priests are not the pure priests of the temple. I mean, these are the ones that have been tainted by the cult of Jeroboam and worshiping the golden calves and all this sort of thing. But they came back down and they said, well, okay, Jehovah's the God down here, and you got to do things his way. And they said, oh, okay. And so they took this twisting of Jehovah worship, blended it with their Assyrian idolatries, and called that good. Well, over the centuries, now this is you know, sometime around 700 BC or so, over the centuries, over the next 300 or 400 years, Jehovah worship eventually won out over the idol worship of Assyria, but it became very tainted and very watered down in the transition. So then, okay, the southern kingdom, Babylon, 70 years, they go back, and then Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilding the city and the temple. Then the Sumerians that had been up there, they've been living here for a few centuries now, and they're kind of, you know, they're half Assyrian and half Israelites from the northern kingdom. And oh yeah, we know Jehovah, let us come down there and help you. Well, Ezra said, no way, we're not going to make that mistake again. You guys stay out of here, we're going to stay pure. And so there was always this severance. Well, and then there was we were talking about the Maccabees earlier, and John Hyrcanus and some of the Maccabean kings that drove the Syrians out in the 2nd century BC. Well, John Hyrcanus, they made him king, and he was really filling those. He said, okay, we got rid of the Syrians, now let's go get the Samaritans. And so they started up, and they started whooping up on the Samaritans, going to drive them all the way out too, and then came the Romans and stopped them. And then that brings us up pretty much to the time of the Bible, or time of the New Testament, time of Christ. And so the Samaritans lived in roughly the same area that the northern kingdom of Israel occupied in the Old Testament times. There are still Samaritans today that live primarily in Tel Aviv and one other town, I forget which one it is, but they live in Israel, and they still do things pretty much the way they did 2,000 years ago. There's not very many of them. I mean, we're talking like a few hundred, but there's still Samaritans around today. Okay, they built a temple on Mount Gerizim, 400 BC. This was confirmed by Alexander the Great when he came through, and then it was destroyed by John Hyrcanus when he came through. a couple of hundred years later, he came, he said, no temple up here, and so he tore it down. And even though there are still some that exist today, they are very much considered outcasts by the other Jews. Now, their Bible, they don't believe that all of the Old Testament is inspired. They only take the 5 books of Moses. That is their canonical scripture. Their chief treasure is a parchment that claimed to be written by, there's a tells piece on the parchment that claims that it was written by the great-grandson of Aaron. His name is Abisha. It says, I, Abisha, the great-grandson of Aaron, have wrote this scroll. They claim that it was rediscovered in 1350. Now, if it was written by Abisha, who was the great-grandson of Aaron, we're going way back, like 1300 BC, 1200 BC, somewhere in that time period, which we don't have nothing of that size. So this would, if that's a real claim, then we're talking phenomenal. The only thing we've got going back that old are just little inscriptions on a piece of rock or something. We don't have any scrolls that old. But this is what it claims to be. And the Samaritans believe it. They believe it very wholeheartedly. Well, in 1952, a Spanish Hebrist by the name of Professor Castro was allowed to examine some photographs of the Abisha scroll. And he discovered, as he was examining them, that it was actually 2 scrolls sewed together. That was 2 different scrolls that had been, they'd been spliced together, and they weren't from the same, same cow. And so they were... There were 2 scrolls tied together, and he remembered an ancient Samaritan tradition that dates back to approximately a little bit before this 1350 time period, where they say that it was rediscovered. And they were having their outdoor ceremony one day, and the priest had it unrolled. He was reading it, and a great wind came along, and it was an old scroll, and fragile. The wind came along, and it tore part of it out of his hand, and it ripped the thing in 2, and part of it was lost. And, just kind of blew on down the road. So they had to get another scroll, tie it back together, and he believes, and so do most scholars, that that's probably this one that they claim to be so many thousands of years old. It's still old. It's still probably 1,000 years old, but it's not the 3,500 that they claim it to be, or 2,500, 3,500. Okay, there are 6,000 variations between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text. 6,000 variations. That sounds like a lot. But of these 6,000, 2,000 of them agree with the Pentateuch text. The Septuagint text. So of the 6,000 variations with the Masoretic, 1/3 of them at least agree with the Septuagint. So that's 2 to 1, in agreement in those 2,000 cases. The majority of these are very insignificant. The majority of these variations are like spelling changes, or, whether it's Lord God Almighty or our Almighty God or something, just very, very insignificant changes like that, with the exception of some sectarian changes. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 12. And I'll show you their primary problem. Deuteronomy 12:5. He says, "But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all your tribes, and put his name before his habitation, and there you shall go." Okay, prophecy referring to Jerusalem. In the Samaritan Pentateuch, it says, "You shall seek the place where the Lord your God has chosen." And they just changed the verb tense. And so you say, okay, well, what place has the Lord your God chosen? And they say, we know. And they point back to chapter 11, verse 29, which says, "And it shall be when the Lord your God has brought you into the land which you shall possess, that you shall put the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the cursing on Mount Ebal." And so that's the place that the Lord your God has chosen. And then they, of course, and then any place where it talks about Mount Ebal, they substitute, as about it being a good place, then they substitute the word Gerizim. If you got your text, turn to page 121. Or I'm sorry, 120. down at the bottom, it says, after a statement of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, 2 to 17, and Deuteronomy 5, 6 to 21. Now this is where the Ten Commandments are in our Bible. It says, after this statement, the Samaritan edition inserts a passage to this effect. And when Yahweh your God brings you into the land of the Canaanites, which you are entering to take possession of it, you shall set up large stones and plaster them with plaster, and you shall write on the stones all the words of this law. And when you pass over the Jordan, you shall set up these stones, concerning which I command you this day, on Mount Gerizim. Okay? And you shall build there, and there you shall build an altar to Yahweh your God, an altar of stones, and you shall lift up no iron tool upon them. With unhewn stones you shall build an altar to Yahweh your God, and you shall offer burnt offerings on it to Yahweh your God, and you shall sacrifice peace offerings, and you shall eat there, and you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God. That mountain is beyond the Jordan, toward the going down of the sun, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, over against Gilgal, beside the terebinth of Morah near Shechem. And then if you notice the footnote down at the bottom, footnote 11, this addition, taken from Deuteronomy 27 and so on, with the substitution of Gerizim for evil, is reckoned by the Samaritans as the 10th commandment. What we call our first commandment, to them is just the preamble. You know, this is the introduction to the 10 commandments, and then they start with commandment number 2 and go all the way through, and then this one forms their 10th commandment. Okay, a fragment of one of the scrolls from the fourth cave is remarkably similar to this, without the sectarian changes. Some of their other literature, they have a Targum. Remember I said a Targum is an Aramaic translation? Well, they have a Targum of their Pentateuch in Aramaic. They also have an Arabic version, Arabic translation. They have a version of Joshua. Now, they have their own story about Joshua, but they don't consider it to be canonical. And, of course, it's totally different as far as it has all of the sectarian slants. And they also have a history book that goes from the death of Joshua up to the Christian era that kind of chronicles their point of view of the northern kingdom and how they just tried to do things right all along and never was really accepted. They always got the, you know, they just were misunderstood. And goes up to the Christian era. Any questions? Yes, Don.
May not have an answer for this, but if the Essenes were truly the conservative, you know, that we say they are, what are they doing with the Samaritan Bible?
That's what I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. And I don't know how much, you know, the textbook mentions that there is one fragment from Cave 4. I was under the impression that there was much more of a witness than just one fragment. Maybe there is, and the textbook doesn't mention them, but I don't know.
Really hard on both of those. 'Cause
Yeah.
just studying the Jews, their culture, their history, I don't think they had liberal
Well,
synagogues.
now, the cave, the manuscripts that were in the Dead Sea Scrolls did not have the parts that I just read. Okay, it didn't have that 11th commandment, or it didn't say
anything.
But well,
from Samaria.
But see, it wasn't. No. It wasn't from Samaria. It was a textual family that the Samaritan Pentateuch was based on.
Okay. So
You can trade.
Okay, so we're saying in actuality, then the Samaritan text really is only 1,000 years old, and so any belief that there was a Samaritan text that was really a Samaritan text is not true.
Right. Yeah.
In actuality, the oldest Samaritan text is 1,000 years AD.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is.
But the Jews back then never would have known. The Essenes wouldn't have known.
No, the Essenes didn't call. Okay, over here's where we keep our Samaritan text.
Well, obviously, though, but I mean, had they even an inkling of where that came from, they would have burned it.
Well, yeah, it wasn't a matter of where it came from. I think it was probably the other way around. I think the Samaritan text came from that textual family. Yeah.
That's perhaps just some
There are places. Okay, I don't know. I'll do this. We're about to run out of time on the tape, but just turn real quickly to Genesis chapter 4. If you've got a study Bible, it might have some footnotes that would shed light on this. Chapter 8, or verse 8 of chapter 4 says, "Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose against Abel his brother and killed him." Now that verse really doesn't make much sense. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field. There's no natural flow from them talking and being in the field. The Samaritan Bible, or we could say the text that the Samaritan Bible was based on, I have a footnote that says the Samaritan Bible, the Septuagint, the Syriac translation, and the Vulgate, practically all of the ancient witnesses except the Masoretic, have, for this particular passage, it says, "And Cain talked with his brother and said, 'Let us go out to the field.' And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him." So this is very possibly a place where this particular textual family and this particular textual family could correct this one, where maybe this one isn't quite accurate. We don't know, but it's a possibility. Okay, let's pray. Father, once again, we thank you for your word. And for me, Lord, to study the ins and outs and the ups and downs of its history and the many great and godly men that have worked in producing and preserving and bringing it down so that I can have this book in front of me today is extremely interesting. And I pray that that wouldn't become our focus to just endeavor to do something interesting, but that our focus would be to be able to appreciate your word and to hide it in our hearts and make that our forefront goal in everything we do. In Jesus' name.